The film opens by introducing Nicholas Angel, a man whose life revolved around being a police officer. But he wasn't just any cop. From his academy days right through his active duty on the streets, he was consistently the best. To put it plainly, whatever skills a police officer needed to nail down criminals, he had them in spades. One afternoon, Nicholas was summoned by his superiors. He'd done it again, bagging dozens of criminals in a shockingly short period. They decided to give him a promotion, but there was a catch. The only available position for his new rank was in a tiny town miles away from the city. What really chafed Nicholas was that he wasn't allowed to refuse the promotion, making him feel completely wronged. He demanded to speak to a higher superior, the inspector. But bizarrely, the inspector echoed the same sentiment. Nicholas pushed further, requesting to speak to even higher brass, only to get the exact same spiel. After some digging, Nicholas finally figured it out. They all collectively couldn't stand him. His sheer diligence and unparalleled success made everyone else look bad, so they were essentially exiling him. Before heading off to his new posting, Nicholas made time for a final farewell to his ex-fiancée. His love life, incidentally, had hit the skids precisely because he was so ridiculously focused on his duties, even though his fiancée was also a police officer. Nicholas journeyed to the remote town of Sanford. Getting there was a whole rigmarole involving several modes of transportation, and by the time he finally arrived, it was already pitch black. After dumping his bags at the local inn, Nicholas decided to hit the pub, hoping to rub shoulders with the locals. What was utterly bizarre was that word of his identity seemed to have preceded him. People already knew who he was. As he was quietly engrossed in reading a newspaper at the bar, Nicholas suddenly realized most of the patrons were underage kids, clearly too young to be boozing it up. He hit the roof, instantly deciding to kick them all out. As a result, the once bustling pub was now completely deserted. The stickler for the rules cop got another bee in his bonnet when one of the patrons, clearly sloshed, tried to drive his car. The drunkard nearly mowed Nicholas down, so Nicholas promptly dragged him to the police station for detainment. On the way, Nicholas even managed to collar a few more youngsters he deemed disturbing public order. And it didn't stop there. When the officers on duty at the station seemed too lazy to process his arrests, Nicholas, in a huff, completed all the paperwork himself. Unsurprisingly, last night's antics became the talk of the town. So the next morning, when Nicholas went for a jog, all the residents greeted him immediately, including a local supermarket manager named Simon. That morning, Nicholas also tried to check on his prisoners, especially the drunk driver who'd almost flattened him. But when he looked for the man, he was already gone from his cell. Turns out, the drunk was actually an active police officer in the town named Danny Butterman. Inspector Frank Butterman, Danny's father and the inspector of Sanford Police, explained that Nicholas's actions last night were technically lawful, but completely out of step with the local norms. Furthermore, Sanford had proudly held the title of the safest town in all of England for years. Therefore, Nicholas simply had to respect the quirky rules in unique ways they did things. The town was so safe, in fact, that their evidence storage warehouse had never once been used. From there, Inspector Frank introduced Nicholas to all the personnel in his office, a number that could literally be counted on one hand. Uniquely, the office even boasted a special room dedicated to monitoring all the town's CCTV cameras. This room was operated by an elderly resident named Tom, ensuring that every movement in Sanford was constantly under surveillance. Despite Nicholas being a bit annoyed with Danny because of his antics the previous night, Danny was actually the only person who genuinely appreciated Nicholas's performance. He openly admired Nicholas, while their other colleagues, seemingly put off by Nicholas's big city arrogance, mostly kept their distance. Danny, however, seemed to genuinely want to follow in Nicholas's footsteps. Next, Nicholas got acquainted with the Neighborhood Watch Alliance, or NWA, and you could probably guess its members, the town elders, gardeners, shop owners, and so on. The hilarious thing was, these neighborhood watchmen seemed even more zealous about maintaining the town's beauty and order than the actual police. That very night, they even gathered to discuss a Silverman, a local performance artist, who they felt was tarnishing the view of the town square. As a serious police officer, Nicholas found himself utterly bored. There was no adrenaline rush, no chasing drug dealers like back in the city. The most exciting call he got was from a resident asking him to find a lost goose. And even that seemingly simple task proved too much for Nicholas and Danny. They didn't manage to catch the goose. Nicholas found himself increasingly irked. As police officers, they shouldn't be slacking off. Every suspicious-looking resident should be considered a potential criminal. But once again, Danny calmly proved his point. In town, everyone knew everyone else, and there was simply no need to worry about crime. While shopping, Nicholas was suddenly hailed by Simon, the supermarket manager he'd met yesterday. This unique character, Simon, struck Nicholas as very suspicious for some reason. As they chatted, Nicholas accidentally caught sight of the CCTV footage playing behind Simon, which clearly showed a young man secretly shoplifting some items. For Nicholas, this was the adrenaline rush he'd been craving. The chase was on. The young man proved quite agile, leading Nicholas on a merry chase, even forcing Nicholas to show off some of his parkour skills by leaping over a fence. Seeing this, Danny, highly impressed, decided to follow suit, though with less grace. In the middle of the chase, Nicholas managed to grab a spray can and, with pinpoint accuracy, hurled it at the thief's head, ending the pursuit. But the kicker was that Peter turned out to be the nephew of the very shop manager he'd stolen from Simon. Instead of facing jail time, Peter was forced to be released because Simon simply refused to file a theft case with the police. Long story short, that afternoon, Danny and Nicholas were assigned to traffic duty. Not long after, a car came speeding by. Nicholas, quick as a flash, managed to pull it over. However, the driver, Martin, a famous actor, and his girlfriend weren't remotely afraid of getting a ticket. They acted completely immune to the law, believing that as the town's celebrity, they deserved special respect. Nicholas, armed only with a pen and notebook, calmly explained how they were breaking the law. He tried to impart this basic policing wisdom to Danny, but Danny, ever the free spirit, turned out to be too creative to follow the rules by the book. That night, as their shift ended, Inspector Frank unexpectedly ordered Nicholas and Danny to attend a Romeo and Juliet performance by Martin and his girlfriend. As representatives of the police, they had to sit through a 3-hour, non-stop drama where Martin's acting was, quite frankly, painfully awful. As soon as the performance wrapped, the residents swarmed Nicholas, including Martin himself. It was then revealed that the woman by his side wasn't his girlfriend, but his mistress, a fact that seemed to displease Simon. As people began to clear out from the stage area, a mysteriously cloaked figure suddenly appeared. This ominous person then brutally murdered Martin and his mistress while they were enjoying themselves in the dressing room. The next morning, their severed heads were discovered on the side of the road, while their bodies were bizarrely arranged, sitting neatly on the car seats. Shockingly, all of Nicholas's colleagues concluded that both of them died due to an accident. Nicholas was flabbergasted. They couldn't possibly conclude this was an accident when there was clear human intervention. Even stranger, not long after, Simon passed by the location and was seen looking surprisingly gleeful about Martin's death. Nicholas knew that not all police officers were allowed to investigate murder cases. Only detectives had the authority. The problem was, the two detectives in their office were, frankly, utterly useless. They even insisted that Martin and his mistress's deaths were nothing more than a result of an accident. In the middle of this ridiculous debate, Nicholas and Danny were suddenly ordered to go to the field because a resident was deemed to have cut down another resident's tree without permission. For this mundane task, they were accompanied by an old police officer named Bob, whose job was to translate the often incomprehensible words of the residents they were about to interrogate. As they were about to head home, Nicholas casually inquired whether the resident they'd just questioned had a permit for the weapon he was holding. The man, Arthur, replied that he did for the one in his hand, but not for the ones stored in his shed. When they checked, it turned out that Arthur's shed was crammed full of World War II-era weapons. He even collected a sea mine, which was most likely still active. In the end, all the weapons were immediately confiscated by the police. The evidence room, which had famously been empty, was now overflowing with old weapons and a sea mine. To celebrate their eventful day, Nicholas and Danny decided to hit the pub for a drink. This was where Nicholas began to open up, revealing that since childhood, he had dreamed of becoming a police officer, wanting to follow in the footsteps of his uncle, who was also a cop. However, in a grim twist, his uncle was eventually arrested for distributing drugs to elementary school children. In stark contrast, Danny became a police officer simply because his late mother had told him to. But thanks to this candid, short conversation, they both became much closer, finally connecting on a personal level. While enjoying their drinks, they bumped into Simon again. His behavior was quite suspicious, as he cryptically remarked that a drunk person in front of them would wake up tomorrow morning in a state of complete mess. The drunk person in question from the previous night was George, a land developer who had a large mansion. He was so utterly sloshed that Nicholas and Danny practically had to carry him home. Little did they know, the mysterious cloaked man from yesterday reappeared after they left, and George would be the next victim. After being brutally struck until he passed out, the perpetrator meticulously arranged his murder to look as if it was due to a gas leak. This incident sent shockwaves through the town, as it meant 3 residents had now died in a short span of time. What's more, that morning Simon again passed the victim's house, a wide, unsettling smile plastered on his face. Nicholas, at his wits' end, pleaded with the detectives to work seriously, but once again, they stubbornly insisted that all these victims had died due to accidents. It was maddening. To cut a long story short, the next day, Nicholas was assigned to patrol the annual town festival. This surprisingly led him to a shooting game, and he couldn't wait to show off his abilities. As a highly trained officer, Nicholas naturally aced the game with a perfect score. When it was Danny's turn to shoot, well, let's just say his aiming was less precise, hitting the stall owner rather than the actual target. That afternoon, Nicholas was suddenly approached by a local journalist named Tim. He wanted to convey his findings about George's death and asked to meet Nicholas later by the church at exactly 3 p.m. Nicholas was impatient to hear what Tim had to say, but he was forced to go on stage to read the names of the lottery winners. At that precise moment, the mysterious killer from yesterday reappeared. Tragically, Tim met his end, seemingly killed by a falling church gargoyle. Nicholas's colleagues once again deemed Tim's death an accident. Luckily, this time, Inspector Frank actually sided with Nicholas, forcing the 2 utterly useless detectives and all of Nicholas's other colleagues to finally carry out their duties seriously. But even after investigating thoroughly, none of them could find any substantial evidence at the crime scene. This drove Nicholas absolutely bananas, especially when Danny, surprisingly, seemed to agree with the others' initial assessment. Realizing he couldn't rely on anyone else in this investigation, Nicholas had to step in himself. All day, he pored over every news article Tim had written. He then relayed the results of his meticulous investigation to Danny, essentially outlining the backgrounds of each murder. But strangely, these murders seemed to lack any reasonable motive. In the midst of this despair, Inspector Frank suddenly appeared, not to offer solace, but to celebrate Danny's birthday. Feeling a bit guilty for not having a gift, Nicholas immediately headed to the florist's shop to buy Danny a birthday present. The shop owner, Mrs. Tiller, revealed she was preparing to move house, and this was her very last day in Sanford. When Nicholas asked why she was suddenly leaving, Mrs. Tiller recounted a long story. Essentially, George had wanted to buy her house at a fantastic price. He'd even sent Martin, the actor, to handle the purchase. But both men had died before they could sign the agreement. The day before his death, the journalist Tim had also warned Mrs. Tiller that the price of her land would significantly increase due to the proposed highway and a mall constructions. Ultimately, feeling cornered, Mrs. Tiller was forced to sell her land to Simon. Just after Nicholas left the shop, Mrs. Tiller was suddenly killed by the mysterious assailant. Not one to miss an opportunity, Nicholas immediately gave chase to the perpetrator. But who would have thought that the killer was incredibly fast, so much so that even Nicholas, a quick runner, couldn't keep up. Unfortunately, all of Nicholas's colleagues again dismissed Mrs. Tiller's murder as an accident. This time, Nicholas could no longer hold back his fury. Inspector Frank then tried to make Nicholas understand his colleagues' behavior, emphasizing that for the past 20 years, there had never been a single murder in Sanford. But Nicholas remained adamant. This time, he vowed to prove who the perpetrator was. Nicholas, accompanied by all his colleagues, paid a visit to Simon. According to Nicholas, Simon had orchestrated the deaths of 4 civilians in order to buy Mrs. Tiller's land cheaply. He posited that, rather than spending money to buy the land, Simon preferred to have Mrs. Tiller killed because he and she were related, meaning that upon her death, the land would automatically become his through inheritance. Nicholas was sure the killer had hit glass while running away earlier, so a telltale scar would still be there. But when it came to the crunch, all of Nicholas's accusations could not be proven. There was no visible mark on Simon. Because of this embarrassing incident, where Nicholas's accusations against Simon couldn't be proven, people began to mock Nicholas, and his belief wavered. He even started to think that all of this might indeed just be an unfortunate string of accidents. Until one afternoon, a startling realization hit Nicholas. The perpetrator of these murders might not be just one person, but the idea was immediately shot down by Inspector Frank, who even temporarily relieved Nicholas of his duties, urging him to calm down. However, when Nicholas arrived back at his motel, a chilling truth was revealed. He was attacked by the mysterious cloaked man he was looking for. The killer he had been searching for all this time turned out to be Michael, an employee of Simon. But this wasn't the full revelation, as that night, Michael was only following orders from his superior. Nicholas knew this from a radio call Michael was carrying after beating the big man. Not wanting to miss this golden opportunity, Nicholas immediately informed Danny about it. Based on the radio information, Michael had been ordered to come to the old castle as soon as he finished killing Nicholas. So that night, Nicholas secretly sneaked into the castle, hoping to catch Simon. But Nicholas was utterly shocked when he discovered that the mastermind of these heinous crimes was not just Simon, but virtually all the members of the Sanford Neighborhood Watch Alliance. These members of the town watchdog felt absolutely no guilt for all their actions. When pressed for the motive behind the victims' murders, they gave answers that were truly beyond reason. Martin and his mistress were killed because they were deemed to have tarnished the art performance with their bad acting. George himself was blown up because his house hadn't been repainted, despite repeated warnings from the NWA. And Tim the journalist was killed simply because he liked making typos in his news articles. They didn't hesitate to kill anyone they considered to have tarnished the beauty and perfection of Sanford. What was even more shocking was that this Village Watchdog Association was, in fact, secretly led by Inspector Frank Butterman. No wonder all the murders in the village for the past 20 years had always been deemed accidents. Anyone who dared to try to steal the title of the most peaceful town from Sanford had to be immediately eliminated, including Nicholas. Even more surprisingly, Danny suddenly showed up as a traitor. Nicholas had no other choice but to escape. In the middle of his desperate escape, Nicholas accidentally fell into a basement. He was horrified to find dozens of bodies in the room, including the very Silver Man, the performance artist who was thought to have tarnished the town square's view just recently. Of course, Nicholas panicked even more as he witnessed all these terrible facts and that his location was surrounded from all directions. At the very last moment, Danny showed up in front of Nicholas and in a quick move, stabbed Nicholas. Turned out, he had secretly saved Nicholas. The blood from the earlier stabbing had actually been tomato sauce. Initially, Danny apparently hadn't known that the NWA members were actually killing residents. He thought they only wanted to expel Nicholas from the town. However, now faced with the undeniable truth, Danny found himself in an impossible position. He couldn't possibly fight his own father, Inspector Frank. If this case were reported to the head office, Nicholas would undoubtedly be considered crazy because, from the very beginning, no one in the force liked him. That's why Danny, in despair, initially gave up and chose to return to his hometown. But in the middle of the road, he had a change of heart after seeing some classic action films that told of tough police struggling against insurmountable odds to uncover the truth. The next morning, Nicholas returned to Sanford, and slowly but surely, he began his personal crusade, catching everyone involved in yesterday's murder spree, even if it meant having to take down the elderly. To do all this, Nicholas obviously needed a serious supply of weapons and ammunition. So he stopped by the police station to pick up some of the weapons confiscated yesterday. Hilariously, none of Nicholas's colleagues seemed to realize what he was about to do. They simply looked on with indifference. From there, the execution of his plan began. As soon as all the residents realized Nicholas's presence, they immediately prepared for action. This time, they no longer hid their ferocity and launched brutal attacks. Even though he was surrounded from various directions, Nicholas, with his expert training, managed to finish off his enemies one by one. Coincidentally, Danny was at that location. As soon as he saw his colleague in action, he didn't hesitate and immediately intervened to help him. Crazy is probably the right word to describe the elderly characters in Sanford, because each of them kept a special weapon, as if living in a war zone. From the local doctor to the priest, Nicholas and Danny had to face a truly relentless fight. The intense brawl suddenly ground to a halt due to the appearance of Inspector Frank. He directed all his troops to arrest both Nicholas and Danny. Luckily, they both managed to convince their colleagues of fellow officers that Inspector Frank was the one at fault, revealing his true role in the conspiracy. Because it was impossible to take them all on at once, Inspector Frank made a break for it, fleeing to Simon's supermarket. But Nicholas and his friends weren't about to stay silent. Without missing a beat, they immediately stormed the place. Turns out, all of Simon's employees in the supermarket were in on this twisted conspiracy. Nicholas found himself up against the big Michael, while his colleagues duked it out with the remaining shop employees. In the end, they managed to take down all of Simon's henchmen. Unfortunately, while they were busy with the brawl, Simon and Inspector Frank had already given them the slip. Nicholas and Danny didn't stay put. A full-blown action movie-style chase ensued. But in the middle of the high-octane pursuit, Simon's car suddenly swerved and careened off the road, all thanks to avoiding that goose Nicholas and Danny had been trying to catch for days. Simon miraculously survived the crash and tried to make a desperate escape by grabbing a small child hostage. But his cowardly move failed spectacularly, and he now had to face Nicholas in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Simon eventually went down, but in a last-ditch effort, he tried to launch a surprise attack. Sadly for him, his foot slipped, and his mouth ended up firmly pierced by a miniature replica of Sanford Abbey. Meanwhile, Inspector Frank, instead of repenting after being saved by his own son Danny, shockingly threatened to kill him. Luckily, Danny managed to escape, but he found himself unable to shoot his own father. This hesitation allowed Inspector Frank to make his getaway. Unfortunate for him, he took Nicholas's car and was attacked by the goose inside, eventually leading to him crashing into a tree. Not long after, the London police chief arrived at the scene. Turns out, after Nicholas's departure, crime in the city had skyrocketed, so they were asking him to return to duty there. Nicholas, however, immediately rejected the offer. As a result of this whole chaotic incident, Nicholas and his colleagues had to work overtime to complete all the arrest files. Almost every single resident now got to experience what it was like to be behind bars. But in the midst of this busy cleanup, they realized there was one more member of the NWA they'd forgotten to arrest. None other than Tom, the CCTV operator. The moment he saw an opening, Tom tried to kill Nicholas. But Danny, quick as a flash, immediately took the hit, shielding Nicholas with his own body. Nicholas, reacting on instinct, reflexively grabbed a trash bag and used it as an improvised weapon to bring Tom down. The attack actually made Tom fall right next to the sea mine, accidentally activating it. The explosion was so big it blew the entire building. After that, Danny looked unconscious, lying on the rubble. Long story short, a year later, Nicholas was seen visiting a grave. But it was not Danny's grave, because thankfully he managed to survive Tom's attack. The grave belonged to Danny's late mother. Nicholas and Danny were there to commemorate the day of her death. Since that day, the Sanford Town Police could no longer slack off. They were the ones truly in charge of enforcing the law.